Four Mexican presidents on the CIA payroll. The secret history of America's longest intelligence partnership. The Central Intelligence Agency maintained one of its most extensive and enduring foreign partnerships with Mexico's ruling Institutional Revolutionary Party (PRI) during the Cold War, with newly declassified documents revealing that four consecutive Mexican presidents served as paid CIA informants from 1958 to 1982. This collaboration enabled joint surveillance operations spanning 36 years, facilitated Mexico's brutal, dirty war that disappeared over 1,200 dissidents, and created a surveillance infrastructure whose legacy persists in Mexico's contemporary targeting of journalists and activists. The relationship fundamentally compromised Mexican sovereignty, while the United States prioritized anti-communist stability over democratic principles, establishing patterns of impunity and authoritarian rule that continue to shape Mexican politics today. Released primarily through the JFK Assassination Records Collection Act, over 80,000 pages of declassified documents expose an intelligence partnership far more collaborative than previously understood. Contrary to assumptions of U.S. unilateral action, Mexican President Adolfo López Mateos actually initiated the massive wiretapping operation in 1958, proposing joint surveillance that would monitor communist embassies alongside his own political opponents. This reveals Mexico not as a passive subject of American intelligence operations, but as an active partner whose leaders leveraged CIA resources to consolidate authoritarian power. The relationship's exposure offers crucial context for understanding Mexico's struggles with violence, corruption, and democratic consolidation 7 decades after it began. A partnership born from Cold War paranoia and mutual benefit. The CIA's relationship with the PRI did not begin with the agency's 1947 creation, but evolved from wartime intelligence cooperation. During World War II, the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, maintained limited operations in Mexico, constrained by FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover's territorial control over Latin America. However, OSS veteran Winston Scott, who would become the architect of CIA-Mexico collaboration, gained early experience in the region that proved formative. When the CIA emerged from the National Security Act of 1947, approximately 1/3 of its personnel were OSS veterans bringing institutional knowledge of Mexican politics. The early Cold War transformed Mexico's strategic importance. Fidel Castro's 1959 Cuban Revolution and subsequent 1960 alignment with the Soviet Union made Mexico crucial as a monitoring point for communist activities in the Western Hemisphere. Mexico City hosted the largest Soviet embassy outside the communist bloc and maintained the only direct commercial flights between the hemisphere and Havana, making the capital what intelligence historians call the Casablanca of the Cold War. Yet Mexico's post-revolutionary nationalism created complications. The government of Lázaro Cárdenas, 1934 to 1940, had nationalized American oil companies in 1938, and Mexico publicly championed anti-imperialist sovereignty while hosting communist exiles. Winston McKinley Scott's appointment as Mexico City station chief in 1956 marked the relationship's transformation. Scott, described by biographer Jefferson Morley as America's virtual proconsul in Mexico, cultivated extraordinarily close personal relationships with Mexican leaders over his 13-year tenure. He attended social functions with presidents, served as confidant to Mexico's intelligence directors, and reportedly had breakfast with President López Mateos nearly every available Sunday during his 6-year term. The Mexico City station became one of the CIA's most important overseas posts, comparable in significance to Berlin for European operations, eventually employing 50 U.S. agents coordinating with 200 Mexican informers. In December 1958, Scott launched Operation Litempo, establishing what CIA documents called an unofficial channel for exchange of selected sensitive political information that bypassed normal diplomatic protocols. This covert program would eventually recruit 14 high-level Mexican government officials as paid CIA informants, including 3 presidents who received regular monthly payments. Yet the relationship's most striking feature, revealed in declassified documents released in 2025, was that Mexico's most sweeping surveillance operation was actually proposed by the Mexican president himself, not imposed by the CIA Operation Lienvoy, when Mexico asked America to help spy on its own citizens. Approximately in 1958, President Adolfo López Mateos approached the CIA with an extraordinary proposal: a massive joint telephone wiretapping operation. According to a 1964 CIA document, the Lienvoy operation resulted from an approach 6 years ago from President López Mateos. After considerable discussions, the operation was approved, providing the Mexican government would include Soviet and satellite targets, and such other communist targets as were obvious to the Mexican government to be of concern to the United States. This revelation fundamentally challenges narratives of U.S. intelligence unilateralism in Latin America. Mexico initiated this surveillance program and staffed it with Mexican Army personnel, with the CIA providing technical equipment, transcribers, and analytical support. The operation monitored 40 telephone lines targeting Cuban, Soviet, Yugoslav, and Czech embassies in Mexico City, but also surveilled prominent Mexican figures, including former President Lázaro Cárdenas, renowned muralist David Alfaro Siqueiros, and former Guatemalan President Juan José Arevalo, living in exile after the CIA-backed 1954 coup against his successor. Monthly operational reports from October 1963 document the surveillance's scope. The CIA assessed Lienvoy as an excellent operation and an outstanding producer of intelligence. The operation used a protected communications system called Condortel, based at a U.S. facility on the Panama Canal, and continued through at least 1994, meaning this joint surveillance program endured for 36 years, spanning 8 Mexican presidencies. A stunning CIA document from 1994 confirms that the agency's partnership with the Mexican government in spying on Cuban and Russian embassies persisted through the administration of Carlos Salinas de Gortari. López Mateos's motivations reveal the operation's dual purposes. While publicly the program targeted foreign communist threats, it simultaneously gave Mexico's ruling party an intelligence apparatus to monitor domestic opposition. The Mexican president received daily intelligence briefings from CIA sources on enemies of the nation, a category encompassing not just foreign agents, but Mexican students, intellectuals, labor organizers, and political opponents. This established a precedent of contradictory overt and covert foreign policies that would define Mexico's Cold War posture. López Mateos publicly declared the United States Mexico's greatest problem, while privately facilitating the most extensive CIA surveillance network in Latin America. The Litempo Network, 4 presidents as paid informants. Operation Litempo represented the CIA's crown jewel, a spy network penetrating the highest levels of Mexican government. Declassified documents identify by cryptonym and name multiple high-ranking officials who received regular CIA payments. Litempo 1, Emilio Bolaños, nephew of President Gustavo Díaz Ordaz. Bolaños received a $400 monthly subsidy during the 1964 presidential campaign, plus a regular salary whose amount remains redacted. In October 1963, CIA Station Chief Scott provided Bolaños with a personal gift of 1,000 rounds of .223 Colt ammunition to pass to his uncle, the president. Litempo II/Litensor, President Adolfo López Mateos, 1958 to 1964. Documents from the 2025 JFK file release confirm López Mateos as a CIA informant who initiated Leanvoy and maintained such close ties with Scott that he served as padrino, chief witness, at Scott's 1962 wedding. The CIA station chief filed reports stating the president trusted him more than official U.S. diplomatic channels. Litempo II, President Gustavo Díaz Ordaz, 1964 to 1970. The numbering confusion in CIA documents suggests multiple coding systems, but declassified files definitively identify Díaz Ordaz as receiving CIA payments. He met regularly with Scott for intelligence briefings and preferred handling U.S.-Mexican relations directly through the CIA rather than the State Department. Díaz Ordaz later ordered the 1968 Tlatelolco massacre while serving as a paid CIA informant. Litempo IV, Fernando Gutiérrez Barrios, Director of Mexico's Federal Security Directorate, DFS, and later Interior Secretary, Gutiérrez Barrios received CIA funds explicitly to protect operations and hide U.S. interference. He masterminded the military operation at Tlatelolco and remained a key CIA asset through the 1980s. His career trajectory, from intelligence director under a dictatorship to state governor and interior minister, illustrates how CIA collaboration advanced officials' political ambitions. Litempo VIII, Luis Echeverría Álvarez, serving as interior minister under Díaz Ordaz before his own presidency, 1970 to 1976. Echeverría was recruited as a CIA agent in the early 1960s. He initially handled visa requests for Cuban travelers, but later provided high-level political intelligence. Echeverría was an occasional dinner guest at Winston Scott's home in the exclusive Lomas Chapultepec neighborhood. He presided over the escalation of Mexico's dirty war as president, while maintaining his CIA connection. Litempo XII, unidentified DFS subordinate. This agent met daily with CIA officer George Monroe and provided intelligence on Mexico's Communist Party, Cuban exiles, Trotskyites, and Soviet bloc cultural groups. He was assessed as the most productive source in these areas. President José López Portillo, 1976 to 1982. Documents declassified in April 2023 revealed López Portillo as a CIA asset for a number of years before assuming office. A November 29, 1976 CIA memorandum, just days before his December 1st inauguration, noted he has had control of liaison for a number of years, meaning oversight of Operation Leanvoy's joint wiretapping. CIA agent Bill Sturbitz warned colleagues it was foreseeable that he would not welcome the fact that this relationship was made public. This roster documents an unprecedented intelligence achievement: penetration of a foreign government at the presidential level for 4 consecutive administrations spanning 24 years. No other CIA foreign partnership achieved comparable access to executive decision-making. CIA officer John Whitten's March 1964 job evaluation criticized the Litempo network, noting agents were paid too much with activities not adequately reported, suggesting even some CIA personnel questioned the program's management and costs. Surveillance and subversion: the full spectrum of CIA operations in Mexico. Beyond Litempo and Leanvoy, the CIA ran dozens of operations targeting communist influence and leftist organizing in Mexico. A 1965 CIA mission directive for Mexico Station outlined comprehensive objectives: intelligence operations against Cuban, Soviet, and Chinese diplomatic installations, infiltration of youth groups and recruitment of students at key schools, combating ultra-nationalistic and anti-U.S. activities in Mexico, and obtaining information on secret intentions and activities of the Mexican government in foreign affairs. The directive notably acknowledged the CIA has neglected the equally important extreme right wing when, in the final analysis, any threat to Mexican political stability by fomenting unrest and incidents does, and will continue to, emanate from the right wing as well as the left wing. Liffire monitored travel between Mexico and Cuba by obtaining passenger manifests from all commercial flights and passport photographs of travelers to Cuba. The CIA could follow passengers to hotels using mobile surveillance trucks. Licala consisted of photo surveillance posts, capturing activity at the Soviet embassy from multiple camera positions. Lisempan involved 8 microphone transmitter installations inside the Cuban embassy starting in 1960 to 61, monitored from surveillance vehicles, and 2 apartments code-named Base House Abel and Base House Baker. La Cobra watched suspicious PRI party members, foreign ministry officials, and government personnel who might become dissidents. Student surveillance proved particularly extensive. Operation Limitor established a network of CIA sources at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, UNAM, and other schools, producing 103 personality reports on suspected communists between August 1962 and July 1963. But the CIA went beyond passive monitoring to active manipulation. Operation Lionchore involved placing CIA agents undercover in publishing and cultural organizations. One agent worked as publisher of the influential magazine Diálogos, providing intelligence on Mexico's left-leaning intellectuals, while unwitting participants like writers Ricardo Garibay, Manuel Calvillo, and Alicia Reyes contributed content. Most controversially, the CIA funded and directed right-wing student shock groups called Poros to attack leftist students and disrupt communist events. Jeremy Wichtrich, cryptonym Lime W/Lihuff1, Vice President of the Royal Crown Cola Company's Mexico operations and Executive Director of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce in Mexico, received $500 monthly from the CIA, equivalent to approximately $4,500 today, to organize and direct student provocateurs. CIA documents reveal the agency could mobilize 5,000 protesters for $4,000 through its student network. On August 26, 1966, CIA-directed student groups attacked a communist Chinese art exhibit at UNAM. The CIA orchestrated campaigns to fire Marxist deans at 3 Mexican universities, Nuevo León, Puebla, and Morelia. The CIA's psychological warfare toolkit included bizarre elements: vials of foul-smelling liquids, substances causing physical discomfort, and itching powder applied to flyers and even toilet seats. Former CIA officer Philip Agee, who defected and published his diary in 1975, described methods including creating propaganda, spreading disinformation, incriminating party members, and coordinating repressive measures with Mexican security forces. This infrastructure of surveillance, infiltration, and provocation laid groundwork for the violence that would explode in 1968. October 2, 1968. When CIA assets massacred students at Tlatelolco. 10 days before the Mexico City Olympics, Mexican security forces opened fire on an estimated 5,000 to 10,000 unarmed civilians gathered at the Plaza de las Tres Culturas in Tlatelolco. Students and families had assembled peacefully when, at approximately 6:10 p.m., a flare signal initiated coordinated shooting from multiple directions. Elite plainclothes agents of the Batallón Olympia, identifiable by white gloves, had been posted in surrounding apartment buildings with shoot-to-kill orders. When they began firing into the crowd, uniformed troops below responded by shooting into the trapped protesters in what survivors described as a closed circle of hell. The death toll remains disputed due to systematic government cover-up. Official counts range from 26 to 300 killed. Non-governmental sources claim hundreds or even thousands died. Approximately 1,000 people were arrested, and hundreds suffered serious injuries. Soldiers bayoneted wounded protesters. Hospitals received orders not to treat the injured, and bodies were removed in military vehicles to undisclosed locations. Eyewitness testimony and photographs revealed a premeditated operation. The Battalion Olympia had been created specifically for this purpose under Interior Minister Luis Echeverria's direction, and snipers had been positioned by Military Chief of Staff General Luis Gutierrez Oropeza with presidential authorization. The CIA's role in this massacre remains controversial but deeply troubling. All three key architects of Tlatelolco were CIA assets. President Gustavo Diaz Ordaz, Litempo II, gave the orders. Interior Secretary Luis Echeverria, Litempo VIII, coordinated operational command. And DFS Director Fernando Gutierrez Barrios, Litempo IV, organized the 2,000-member Battalion Olympia. Before the massacre, the CIA had funded student provocateur groups and provided Mexican security forces with military radios, weapons, ammunition, and riot control training in preparation for Olympic security. When violence erupted, CIA Station Chief Winston Scott filed 15 different, sometimes flatly contradictory reports about what happened. Because Scott relied exclusively on his Litempo informants, the very officials who ordered the massacre, the CIA effectively became what National Security Archive analyst Kate Doyle calls a stenographer for its friends and allies in the Mexican government. Scott reported the government's fabricated narrative as intelligence, that students had fired first with machine guns, that the protest was controlled by a Trotskyite Olympia Brigade provocateurs, and that Cuban and Chinese communist groups had carefully planned the violence with Soviet involvement. CIA documents reveal the agency knew this was false. A CIA weekly summary from September 27, 1968, noted that most reports linking student movement to subversion remain unsubstantiated. A secret report to President Lyndon Johnson dated October 5, 1968 concluded, "No evidence exists of significant foreign influence in riots." A State Department telegram from October 12 stated, "Contrary to official Mexican reports, direct foreign involvement in student uprisings has been essentially negligible. Foreign influence argument has been used by Mexican government to divert attention away from deep local problems. Yet the CIA protected its assets rather than reporting their responsibility. Not until a January 1971 CIA report did the agency acknowledge that Echeverria shares heavily in the blame for Tlatelolco, and even then warned that U.S.-made equipment used in the crackdown would involve the United States if connections became public. One CIA agent, cryptonym LIEMBRACE4, was among those detained at Tlatelolco, but released within days. A detail suggesting possible CIA operational presence at the scene. 10 pages of CIA station history on student operations remain completely redacted, even in recent declassifications, indicating ongoing sensitivity about the agency's exact role. The massacre succeeded in its immediate objective, terrorizing the student movement into silence. Mexico hosted the Olympics without further disruption. But Tlatelolco marked Mexico's entry into what would become known as the Dirty War, a period of systematic state terrorism against dissidents that would last over 2 decades and claim more than 1,200 documented lives. The Dirty War: American complicity in mass disappearances and torture. From approximately 1965 to 1990, the Mexican government waged a brutal counterinsurgency campaign against leftist guerrillas, student activists, labor organizers, and rural movements. Mexico's Truth Commission, which released comprehensive findings in 2024, documented systematic and widespread human rights abuses against broad sectors of the population, including at least 1,200 forced disappearances, though the actual number is certainly higher, with the Association of Relatives of Victims documenting 470 disappearances in just Atoyac municipality alone. Methods included systematic torture, beatings, near drownings, tehuacanazo, fizzy water forced up the nose, chichara, electric cattle prod, applications, and sexual assault of female prisoners. Security forces operated clandestine detention centers, including basement torture chambers at DFS headquarters. Victims were subjected to extrajudicial executions, with bodies disposed of in mass graves or through death flights, prisoners thrown alive from aircraft into the Pacific Ocean. The Truth Commission identified over 2,000 public officials involved in repressive system, including 200 members of the DFS intelligence agency. The Brigada Blanca, White Brigade, epitomized this repression. Created in summer 1976, this elite death squad of approximately 200 to 240 agents operated under the command of Miguel Nazar Haro, nicknamed El Turco, who had been a CIA asset since 1961. The brigade's primary target was the Liga Comunista 23 de Septiembre, Mexico's most prominent urban guerrilla organization. In rural Guerrero State, the army fought viciously against the Asociación Cívica Nacional Revolucionaria and the Partido de los Pobres, Party of the Poor, led by schoolteacher Lucio Cabañas, who was killed in December 1974. Military units torched villages, kidnapped alleged conspirators, and committed widespread sexual violence. U.S. involvement in this systematic terrorism took multiple forms. The CIA provided training in counterinsurgency techniques to Mexican security forces, supplied surveillance technology and expertise for tracking dissidents, and maintained intelligence sharing arrangements that enabled repression. Most significantly, the CIA protected key perpetrators because they were valuable intelligence assets. When Miguel Nazar Haro was later indicted for involvement in a multi-million-dollar stolen car ring operating between the U.S. and Mexico, the CIA intervened to prevent his prosecution, with the agency admitting Nazar was its most important source in Mexico and Central America. U.S. Attorney William Kennedy was fired by the Reagan administration for attempting to prosecute this CIA asset. CIA documents reveal the agency's assessment of Mexican security forces as largely poorly trained, insecure and unreliable, dishonest, cruel, and abusive as early as the 1960s. Yet this knowledge did not prevent collaboration. If anything, it facilitated leverage over compromised officials. A CIA intelligence information cable from 1980 described General Francisco Quiros Hermosillo, who had commanded the Brigada Blanca, as head of an extra-legal anti-terrorist organization when he was promoted to third in command of Mexico's defense ministry. Quiros Hermosillo is now identified as the intellectual author of the death flights in Guerrero. The official U.S. position prioritized stability of the Mexican regime over human rights concerns. A 1985 CIA analysis stated that corruption and repression were essential to the operation and survival of Mexico's complex form of government. State Department cables acknowledged occasional extra-legal actions by the security forces, but maintained diplomatic support for PRI rule. As National Security Archive researchers document, U.S. reporting justified human rights violations as a necessary evil to contain the threat of communism, establishing a pattern where Washington valued Mexican regime's stability over all else. This complicity had devastating consequences. Families of disappeared persons spent decades searching for loved ones without government assistance or acknowledgement. The culture of impunity established during the Dirty War persists today. Mexico's current rate of impunity for crimes exceeds 95%, and over 40,000 people remain disappeared in contemporary violence. The surveillance infrastructure and interrogation techniques developed with CIA assistance during this period evolved into Mexico's modern security apparatus, which continues to target journalists, activists, and political opponents. When the drug war met the Cold War, the Camarena affair and CIA cartel connections. The 1980s brought convergence between anti-communist operations and the emerging drug war, with explosive results. On February 7, 1985, Drug Enforcement Administration Special Agent Enrique "Kiki" Camarena was kidnapped outside the U.S. consulate in Guadalajara by Mexican Federal Security Directorate DFS agents working for the Guadalajara cartel. After over 30 hours of torture, his skull punctured, ribs broken, body subjected to electric shocks, Camarena and pilot Alfredo Zavala Avalar were murdered. Camarena had been investigating the Guadalajara cartel, particularly Rafael Caro Quintero's massive marijuana operations. In November 1984, he organized a raid on Rancho Buffalo that destroyed 1,300 acres of marijuana plantations, worth an estimated $8 billion annually, the largest marijuana seizure in history at that time. He had also developed Operation Padrino, targeting the cartel's financial accounts. Discovering that Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo was moving $20 million monthly through a single Bank of America account. Multiple former DEA agents and a CIA contractor have alleged that CIA operatives were present during Camarena's interrogation, recording the session. Hector Bareles, who led the DEA's Operation Leyenda investigation into Camarena's murder, stated in 2013, CIA operatives were in the interrogation room, actually conducting the interrogation, actually taping Kiki. Phil Jordan, former director of the DEA's El Paso Intelligence Center, and CIA pilot Tosh Plumlee corroborated these claims. According to these sources, CIA agent Felix Rodriguez, alias Max Gomez, questioned Camarena about what he knew regarding CIA involvement in drug trafficking. The allegation centers on the Iran-Contra affair and CIA support for Nicaraguan rebels. According to the theory, supported by evidence presented at the 1990 Los Angeles trial of Camarena's accused killers, the CIA was collaborating with Mexican drug traffickers to fund the Contras through drug profits. Rafael Caro Quintero's ranch in Veracruz was allegedly used for training Contras. Drug lords' clandestine airstrips served CIA operations. Planes would fly arms south to Nicaraguan rebels, refuel at cartel-owned Mexican facilities, pick up cocaine in Colombia, and return to the United States with narcotics. The DFS, staffed by CIA assets, provided protection to this network. The most damning piece of evidence involves Setco Airline, owned by Honduran drug lord Juan Ramon Mata Ballesteros, who had amassed $2 billion fortune trafficking narcotics. The Kerry Committee report to Congress confirmed that between January and August 1986, the U.S. State Department paid Setco $185,924.25 for flying humanitarian supplies to the Contras, even as the DEA had identified SETCO as smuggling narcotics into the United States. In 1998, CIA Inspector General Fred Hitz admitted the CIA worked with a variety of pilots who ferried supplies to the Contras, who were alleged to have engaged in drug trafficking activity. Mexican investigative journalist Manuel Buendia had been investigating these same connections. On May 30th, 1984, 9 months before Camarena's kidnapping, Buendia was shot 4 times in the back, leaving his office. His assassin fled on a motorcycle. Buendia was Mexico's most influential investigative journalist, and he had been documenting the CIA-DFS drug cartel triangle. His colleague Javier Juarez Vázquez, who was investigating the clandestine airstrips, was also killed the same day. DFS director José Antonio Zorrilla Pérez, who would be convicted in 1989 of ordering Buendia's murder, was first to arrive at the scene, paid for the funeral, and ordered seizure of all documents from Buendia's office. Evidence tying him to the CIA and traffickers was lost for 5 years. The DEA and FBI investigations into Camarena's murder were repeatedly obstructed. DEA agents accused the CIA of stonewalling their investigation to protect assets, including top drug trafficker Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo. At the 1990 trial, defense attorneys attempted to question the CIA drug trafficking connection, but the judge prevented testimony about CIA sanctioning of narcotics trafficking. Miguel Nazar Haro's CIA connection was not disclosed to defendants. The CIA has vehemently denied all allegations as ridiculous, but the Justice Department reopened its investigation in 2019, and the case continues to generate controversy through documentaries like Amazon's The Last Narc, 2020. Whether or not CIA agents were literally in the room during Camarena's torture, the broader relationship between U.S. intelligence and Mexico's DFS created conditions enabling the murder. The DFS was dissolved in 1985, immediately after the Camarena scandal, replaced by CISEN, Centro de Investigación y Seguridad Nacional. But the pattern of intelligence agencies providing protection to drug traffickers in exchange for cooperation on security matters, established during the Cold War, became institutionalized in Mexican governance, contributing directly to the explosion of cartel violence that has claimed over 400,000 lives since 2006. The fraudulent 1988 election, democracy manipulated through intelligence networks. On the evening of July 6, 1988, Mexicans watched early returns showing opposition candidate Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas, son of the revered former president who had nationalized oil and championed Mexican sovereignty, leading in the presidential election. Then, at 7 p.m., Interior Secretary Manuel Bartlett Diaz announced the vote-counting computer system had crashed. The phrase, "se cayó el sistema," the system fell, became synonymous in Mexico with electoral fraud. For 7 days, vote counting halted. At 3:10 a.m., the PRI declared Carlos Salinas de Gortari the winner before any official count was complete. When results were finally announced on July 13th, Salinas had won with 50.36%, the lowest margin in PRI history. President Miguel de la Madrid admitted in his 2004 autobiography that the system never actually crashed. The Federal Electoral Institute director acknowledged in 1994 that the system was forced to fail. Analysis in 2019 using artificial intelligence on vote tally sheets revealed approximately 1/3 showed blatant alterations, concentrated precisely in areas where opposition poll monitors were absent. In what can only be described as Soviet-style results, 1,762 polling stations reported 100% votes for the PRI. The orchestrator of this fraud was Manuel Bartlett Diaz, who as Interior Minister controlled the vote-counting process. The same official who had overseen the Interior Ministry during the Camarena affair and whose involvement in drug trafficking Buendia had been investigating. 3 state governors were forced to resign for allowing opposition victories. Congress validated the fraudulent results in a 20-hour session with 263 PRI votes versus 85 opposition. In an act of extraordinary cynicism designed to destroy evidence permanently, the PRI and PAN parties agreed in 1992 to burn all ballots from the election. While no declassified documents directly prove CIA involvement in the 1988 electoral fraud, multiple factors raised serious questions. The Interior Ministry, which controlled the vote count, had historically been staffed by CYA assets, including Luis Echeverria, Le Tempo 8, and Fernando Gutierrez Barrios, Le Tempo 4, who served as Interior Secretary from 1988 to 1993. The CIA maintained paid informants throughout the presidency and Interior Ministry through its Le Tempo network. Academic research by political scientist Dov Levin documents that the CIA intervened in 81 foreign elections between 1946 and 2000, with Italy's 1948 election serving as the template for electoral interference through covert funding, media manipulation, and intelligence operations. Moreover, just days before the election, Francisco Xavier Ovando, Cardenas's top advisor, and his assistant were assassinated on June 30, 1988. The timing and targeting of opposition leadership before what would become Mexico's most fraudulent election invites obvious questions about political violence and intelligence involvement. The United States, which had spent decades supporting the PRI's authoritarian rule as a Cold War bulwark against communism, had obvious interests in preventing a leftist opposition victory that threatened to pursue more nationalist economic policies and potentially investigate the CIA-Mexico relationship. The 1988 fraud marked both the nadir and beginning of the end of PRI dominance. Massive nationwide protests followed the stolen election, and the episode fatally wounded the party's legitimacy. In 2000, Vicente Fox of the National Action Party, PAN, won the presidency in what international observers certified as Mexico's first fully free and fair election, ending 71 years of uninterrupted PRI rule, the longest single-party dominance in modern democratic history. Yet the 12 years between the fraudulent election and democratic transition demonstrated the PRI's determination to maintain power through any means necessary, including electoral manipulation enabled by intelligence networks built with CIA assistance. From Cold War partnership to drug war cooperation. The relationship's evolution after 2000. Mexico's democratic transition in 2000 fundamentally altered the CIA-PRI relationship's character, though intelligence cooperation continued under different frameworks. There is no evidence that Presidents Vicente Fox, 2000 to 2006, or Felipe Calderón, 2006 to 2012, of the National Action Party, maintained the intimate, payment-based relationships that characterized CIA dealings with PRI presidents. The democratic transition, competitive elections, and greater institutional transparency created different dynamics for intelligence cooperation. However, President Calderón's December 2006 decision to deploy military forces against drug cartels, a strategy that ultimately claimed over 55,000 lives during his term, initiated unprecedented security cooperation with the United States. The Merida Initiative, launched in 2008 during the Bush and Calderón administrations, provided over $1.9 billion in U.S. assistance for equipment, training, technology, and institution building in Mexican security forces. The Washington Post reported in 2013 that this created an unparalleled alliance against Mexico's drug cartels, one based on sharing sensitive intelligence. The CIA and DEA provided training for vetted units within Mexican forces, established intelligence plumbing for information sharing, and supplied surveillance equipment, including drones. By 2014 to 2016, the CIA operated a covert drone program from Mexico with government permission, conducting surveillance flights credited with intelligence leading to arrests of Joaquin El Chapo Guzman in 2014 and 2016, as well as several other prominent cartel figures. In the U.S. Embassy, CIA analysts were positioned on the same floor as the ambassador, himself a former CIA officer, while DEA and Homeland Security investigations were relegated to lower floors, suggesting the CIA's primacy in security cooperation during this period. When the PRI briefly returned to power under Enrique Peña Nieto, 2012 to 2018, initial signals suggested reduced cooperation. The Ventanilla Única, single-window policy, required all U.S. security and intelligence agencies to work through a central coordinating office in the Interior Ministry. This emerged partly from concern about an August 2012 incident where two alleged CIA agents traveling with Mexican naval officers were attacked by federal police south of Mexico City. The CIA agents had been operating with Mexican naval personnel without civilian authorities' knowledge. However, as Peña Nieto's term progressed, security policies came to resemble Calderón's, with continued high-value targeting operations capturing or killing 109 of the 122 traffickers Mexico considered most dangerous. The 2018 election of Andrés Manuel López Obrador, AMLO, with the left-wing Morena Party, brought sharp reduction in security cooperation. AMLO pursued abrazos, no balazos, hugs, not bullets, a less confrontational approach to organized crime, focusing on addressing violence's root causes. Following the U.S. arrest of former Defense Minister General Salvador Cienfuegos on drug charges based on DEA investigations, Mexico's Congress enacted a law in 2020 limiting foreign law enforcement activities in the country. Intelligence cooperation decreased to nearly zero, according to analysts, and Mexico stopped approving most Merida Initiative programs. President Claudia Sheinbaum, who took office in 2024, appears to be adjusting AMLO's approach, suspending the hugs, not bullets strategy, and launching new security initiatives that lean toward binational cooperation. Her Security Secretary, Omar Garcia Harfuch, has signaled willingness to work with U.S. agencies, though tension exists within the Morena Party between this pragmatic approach and ideological preferences for minimal foreign involvement. A 2025 Reuters report claimed CIA-vetted units continue operating within Mexican military, though Sheinbaum disputed the report while acknowledging some CIA military cooperation. The contemporary relationship faces complications from migration pressures, the fentanyl crisis, trade disputes, and Mexican nationalist sentiment opposing foreign intervention. The Trump administration's threats to designate cartels as foreign terrorist organizations, proposals for drone strikes in Mexico, and tariff leverage have created diplomatic tensions. Yet the fundamental pattern established during the Cold War persists. Mexico's security challenges create incentives for cooperation, while concerns about sovereignty and the CIA's historical abuses generate resistance. The relationship has evolved from covert presidential collaboration to institutionalized security partnerships, but its contradictions endure. Legacy of surveillance, from Leanvoy wiretaps to Pegasus spyware. Perhaps the most insidious legacy of CIA-PRI collaboration is the surveillance infrastructure it created. The joint wiretapping operations of the 1960s established technical capabilities, institutional practices, and a culture of monitoring dissent that evolved into Mexico's modern surveillance state. Mexico was the first country in the world to purchase the infamous Pegasus spyware in the mid-2000s from Israeli firm NSO Group, and the Peña Nieto administration, 2012 to 2018, deployed it countless times against journalists, human rights activists, lawyers, and political opponents. Over 15,000 Mexican phone numbers were selected for potential surveillance, including Andrés Manuel López Obrador, and over 50 associates before his 2018 presidential campaign. Targets included AMLO's cardiologist, Morena Party members, and dozens of figures investigating government corruption and human rights abuses. During the 2017 State of Mexico gubernatorial election, extensive surveillance targeted opposition figures. The PRI retained control of the state. Journalists covering government corruption, the Ayotzinapa case of 43 disappeared students, and organized crime were systematically targeted. Investigations by The Washington Post revealed that Mexico's Truth Commission investigators, working to document dirty war atrocities committed with CIA complicity, were themselves targeted with Pegasus spyware. This created a perverse circle. Victims of state terrorism enabled by U.S. intelligence cooperation in the 1960s to 1980s, attempting to document those crimes in the 2020s, were surveilled using technology whose deployment traces directly to surveillance infrastructure established with CIA assistance decades earlier. The technical and institutional continuity is striking. Operation Leanvoy's 40 telephone lines monitored by the CIA and Mexican Army in 1958 evolved into computerized databases, then digital surveillance systems, then sophisticated spyware capable of accessing every file, message, location, and communication on a target's phone. The DFS officials, trained by the CIA in the 1960s, mentored subsequent generations of intelligence officers. When the DFS was dissolved in 1985 following the Camarena scandal, it was replaced by CISIN, which inherited personnel, techniques, and institutional culture. CISIN received training from Israeli intelligence agency Mossad, starting with the 1994 Zapatista uprising, creating new international partnerships, but maintaining continuity with Cold War-era practices. The targets have remained consistent across 6 decades: leftist political movements, student activists, indigenous organizations, land reform advocates, labor organizers, independent journalists, human rights defenders, and anyone threatening established power structures. What began as joint CIA-Mexican surveillance of Cuban and Soviet embassies became a comprehensive apparatus for monitoring and controlling domestic dissent, with technology evolving but fundamental purposes unchanged. International human rights organizations have repeatedly condemned Mexico's surveillance practices. The Inter-American Commission on Human Rights and United Nations Special Rapporteurs have documented systematic targeting of civil society. Yet prosecutions remain virtually non-existent, and the culture of impunity established during the CYA collaborative era persists. Mexico's surveillance state, like its patterns of forced disappearances, torture, and political violence, represents living continuity with the Cold War security apparatus built with American assistance. What the scholars conclude: mutual complicity and lasting damage. Academic assessment of the CIA-PRI relationship has evolved dramatically with each wave of declassifications. Jefferson Morley's 2008 biography of Winston Scott, based on extensive CIA documents, revealed the depth of personal relationships between CIA officers and Mexican presidents. Morley documented how Scott's reliance on high-level Litempo informants misled Washington about responsibility for the Tlatelolco massacre, with the CIA serving as stenographer for its friends and allies in the Mexican government, rather than providing independent intelligence. Mexican scholar Sergio Aguayo, a Level 3 researcher in Mexico's National Researcher System and author of multiple books on intelligence services and state violence, has argued that the CIA bears joint responsibility for 1968's deaths and suffering. His 2018 book examining CIA involvement concludes that Winston Scott fed the anti-communist fantasies of President Diaz Ordaz, justifying use of force against students. Aguayo's archival research documented that Diaz Ordaz was on the CIA payroll, revealing the fundamental compromise of Mexican sovereignty during the Cold War. Kate Doyle of the National Security Archive at George Washington University, who has filed over 1,600 FOIA requests since 1994, emphasizes the relationship's bilateral nature. Her 2025 analysis of newly released JFK files notes that Mexico welcomed CIA into the country and actively sought to participate in espionage operations. The declassified documents reveal that Operation Lionvoy was initiated by Mexican President López Mateos, not the CIA, challenging narratives of unilateral U.S. imposition and highlighting Mexican agency in creating the surveillance state. This finding doesn't absolve the CIA, but complicates understanding of how authoritarian regimes leverage foreign partnerships. Comparative political science research provides context for understanding the relationship's impact. A 2024 study published in the Journal of Comparative Economics examining CIA-sponsored regime change in Latin American countries, Ecuador 1963, Brazil 1964, Chile 1964, Bolivia 1964, Panama 1981, found that CIA interventions led to large declines in democracy, with scores almost 200% lower than predicted 5 years post-intervention. The Mexico case differs as partnership rather than imposed regime change, but scholars note similar authoritarian impacts. The CIA relationship enabled what political scientists classify as a hegemonic party autocracy to maintain power for 71 years. Research published in the Journal of Democracy documents how U.S. policy prioritized stability over democratic values, with the United States remaining silent about Mexican internal politics for many decades after World War II, preferring smooth relations to pressure for change. Council on Foreign Relations analyses warn against returning to this old U.S. pattern of silence as contemporary Mexico faces challenges to democratic institutions. The Brookings Institution's 2023 assessment, Mexico Takes Another Step Toward Its Authoritarian Past, cites PRI-era CIA collaboration as cautionary precedent for understanding risks of democratic backsliding. The scholarly consensus identifies several lasting impacts. First, the relationship fundamentally compromised Mexican sovereignty, with 4 consecutive presidents prioritizing CIA interests and receiving payments that made them beholden to a foreign intelligence service. Second, it enabled systematic human rights abuses during the Dirty War by protecting perpetrators and providing training, equipment, and intelligence for counterinsurgency operations. Third, it established patterns of impunity that persist today. The culture where state officials face no consequences for violence against civilians. Fourth, it created surveillance infrastructure with enduring capacity to target dissent. Fifth, it delayed democratization by helping the PRI maintain authoritarian control until 2000. Most fundamentally, the relationship reveals how Cold War priorities led the United States to support authoritarianism in Latin America, even in countries like Mexico that didn't experience coups. The CIA-PRI partnership was presented as defending democracy against communism, but its effect was preserving one-party rule, suppressing democratic opposition, enabling mass human rights violations, and protecting drug trafficking networks when convenient for U.S. foreign policy objectives. This contradiction, supporting authoritarianism in democracy's name, represents the relationship's core hypocrisy and most troubling legacy. Conclusion: the enduring costs of Cold War collaboration. The relationship between the CIA and Mexico's PRI stands as one of the most extensive and consequential intelligence partnerships in Cold War history, characterized by unprecedented access to foreign leadership, mutual benefits for both countries' security establishments, and devastating human costs for Mexican civilians. What began in 1958 with President López Mateos's proposal for joint surveillance evolved into a comprehensive collaboration involving paid presidential informants, massive wiretapping operations, systematic repression of dissidents, protection of drug traffickers, and the creation of surveillance infrastructure that continues targeting journalists and activists today. Recent declassifications, particularly the 2025 release of JFK assassination files, containing over 80,000 pages of documents, have fundamentally revised understanding of this relationship. The confirmation that 4 consecutive Mexican presidents served as CIA assets from 1958 to 1982 represents an intelligence achievement without parallel in the Western Hemisphere. Yet this success came at extraordinary cost. Over 1,200 documented disappearances during Mexico's Dirty War, actual numbers likely much higher, massacres at Tlatelolco and Corpus Christi claiming hundreds of lives, complicity in torture and extrajudicial executions, systematic electoral fraud, and the compromise of Mexican democratic development for generations. The relationship's complexity resists simplistic narratives. Mexico was not merely a victim of U.S. imperialism. Presidents López Mateos, Díaz Ordaz, Echeverría, and López Portillo actively sought CIA collaboration to consolidate their own power and monitor domestic opponents. The PRI leveraged American resources for its authoritarian project while maintaining public anti-imperialist rhetoric. Yet this agency doesn't diminish U.S. responsibility. The CIA knowingly supported officials it assessed as dishonest, cruel, and abusive, protected human rights violators like Miguel Nazar Haro because they were valuable assets, and prioritized Cold War objectives over democratic values and human rights. Perhaps most disturbing is the continuity between past and present. The surveillance techniques developed through Leonvoy evolved into Pegasus spyware targeting today's dissidents. The interrogation methods used on disappeared persons during the Dirty War continue in contemporary security operations. The culture of impunity established when CIA protection shielded officials from accountability persists in Mexico's 95+% impunity rate. The institutional corruption that allowed DFS officials to simultaneously serve as intelligence directors and drug cartel protectors became embedded in Mexican governance, contributing to the cartel violence that has claimed over 400,000 lives since 2006. The pattern of fraudulent elections refined in 1988 influenced subsequent electoral manipulation attempts. Mexico continues grappling with this legacy. The Truth Commission established under López Obrador has documented dirty war atrocities and identified perpetrators, but prosecutions remain elusive. Families of the disappeared still search for loved ones, still demand justice that seems perpetually deferred. Journalists investigating corruption and violence work under threat, several murdered each year. The Ayotzinapa case, 43 students forcibly disappeared in 2014, demonstrates that techniques of state violence persist. When Truth Commission investigators were themselves targeted with Pegasus spyware, it revealed how surveillance infrastructure built with CIA collaboration during the Cold War continues serving authoritarian ends in the 21st century. For the United States, the CIA-PRI relationship raises profound questions about intelligence practices and foreign policy values. The ends justify means logic of Cold War anti-communism led to decades of support for authoritarian governance, systematic human rights violations, and protection of drug traffickers, all in the name of stability. These choices created blowback. The protected drug trafficking networks evolved into cartels now flooding U.S. cities with fentanyl. The culture of violence and impunity drives migration flows that strain bilateral relations. The historical grievances periodically surface to complicate cooperation. And the fundamental trust deficit makes contemporary security collaboration more difficult. The relationship's full reckoning remains incomplete. While scholars now have access to extensive documentation about 1950s to 1980s operations, much remains classified about later periods and specific operational details. Mexican and U.S. governments have acknowledged historical abuses but offered limited accountability. The patterns established through this Cold War partnership, prioritizing security cooperation over human rights, accepting authoritarian governance as the price of stability, deploying surveillance against civil society, continue shaping bilateral relations even as both countries' political contexts have dramatically transformed. Understanding this history is essential for confronting its legacies and avoiding repetition of its mistakes. The CIA-PRI relationship demonstrates how intelligence partnerships can facilitate authoritarianism, enable mass atrocities, and create enduring damage to democratic institutions and civil liberties. It reveals the long-term costs when governments prioritize short-term strategic objectives over fundamental values. And it underscores the necessity of transparency, accountability, and continued historical investigation to ensure that the victims of state terrorism are not forgotten and that the systems enabling such violence are finally dismantled rather than merely rebranded for new generations.